Welcome to the Crunch McDabbles Show. I'm your host, Crunch McDabbles. This is the only show dedicated to helping you survive the dangerous world of Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Today's show, Snare Crafting. Well, Snare Crafting, what better strategy is there than to lay out a trap and lure an enemy into it? It's strategy, beautiful strategy. How beautiful? Let's find out together. First off, why use snares? Well, let's map this out. You have your turn, you get 3 actions, you can use these actions to damage the enemy, and that's great, that's what you should do if you want to survive. But then there's this whole other region known as not your turn, and sometimes you can damage monsters here too if you have a reaction that allows you to do that, and that's great, we like that. That's using the full breadth and depth of our turn to deal damage, but reactions have triggers that need to be met, and you only have a limited number of them each round. Snares are unique in that they allow you to damage the enemy on their turn without using any reaction. Does that grab your attention? Damage monsters on their turn with no reaction. That's the beauty of snares. So how do we get in on this? Well, you just need 4 things. 1, you need to be trained in crafting. 2, you need the snare crafting skill feat. 3rd, you need a snare kit. That's going to set you back 5 gold and uses up 2 bulk, but you need it. And finally, you're going to need some materials. The materials, they don't seem like they need to be anything in particular, just an amount of money spent on materials. So 6 gold pieces in materials will allow you to craft 2 level 1 snares of whichever kind. So some snares require additional materials listed after the snares entry under crafting requirements, so you'd have to purchase these too. But once you have some materials, we're ready to get started making snares. So choose a square that you want to be snared. Spend 1 minute placing the snare and spend the materials, and boom, that square is now trapped. The next medium or large creature that walks into that square will set it off. So it's interesting that there's no exception spelled out here as far as walking into our own snare. So if you walk into a square, even knowing that you just put a snare there, you're going to set it off. Now that we've placed our snare, can a monster detect it? Maybe. Monsters, when they're in exploration mode, this is before combat starts, they would get a perception check versus the stealth DC of the snare when they enter the area that the snare was in. The stealth DC for your snare is going to be your crafting DC, so that's a reason to have a good crafting score. However, that's during exploration mode. As soon as an encounter mode starts, this is no longer the case. The monster is now focused only on killing you. It could use an action on its turn to use the seek action for a trap if it had some reason to suspect one. When they seek, they're going to search a 10-foot by 10-foot area, so there may be some advantage to placing your snares 10 feet apart. Then, when something walks into a space with the snare goes off doing whatever it says it does in the snare description. If there's a saving throw, the DC is listed in the snare description. So it doesn't matter how good a crafter you are at this point, the DC of the snare is based on the type of snare. The spike snare, for example, is a DC 17 basic reflex save, no matter how great a crafter you are. Now, those are the basics of snare crafting. There are 3 ways to get much better at using snares. You can be a ranger, you can take the Snare Crafter archetype, or by making your ancestry a kobold. The big difference here, all 3 of these have some version of the Snare Specialist feat. What do you get with this feat? Well, first of all, it gives you new snare formulas as your crafting proficiency increases. This allows you to add new formulas when you increase your crafting proficiency, which is great. But more importantly, though, Snare Specialist lets you each day during your daily preparations, you can prepare 4 snares for quick deployment. These quick deployment snares don't require materials or resources to craft, which is great. So all that stuff we said before about needing materials, throw that stuff out the window. That's for beginners. Also, as if you needed more than that, you can deploy these snares using 3 actions instead of a full minute. So that, well, it's something. It's definitely faster. I don't know if you want to drop 3 actions in the middle of a combat to put down a snare, but you could. It opens up some possibilities. So the Snare Specialist lets us make snares each day for no material cost. That's the advantage. That's what makes it great. The Ranger gets this feat at 4th level. The Snare Crafter archetype gets this identical feat with the Snare Crafter dedication, and it's available at 2nd level, and you only have to be trained in crafting, not expert. And if you don't mind waiting until 5th level, the Cobbled Ancestry feat Snare Genius gives us a slightly watered down version of this, which still might be okay, especially since it's an Ancestry feat, allowing you to keep your class feats focused on whatever you wanted. Also, all of these are cumulative. That's their word, not mine. Anyways, if you make a Ranger with the Snare Crafter dedication that is also a Cobbled with Snare Genius, you would have 6,000 snares available each day with your daily preparations that don't cost you anything. That can't be right. 6,000. Wow. At 6th level, the Ranger has quick snares, and the Snare Crafter gets this same feat at 8th level, 2 levels later. And now they can place that snare. They can place any snare you make using 3 actions, not just the ones you prepared for quick deployment with your daily preparations. At 8th level, the Ranger has another great feat, Powerful Snares. The Snare Crafter can get this 2 levels later at level 10. This allows you to change the DC of the snare to your class DC instead of the DC listed in the snare entry. Remember how we said that the snare's DC was whatever was listed in the snare entry? This keeps your lower level snares relevant, increasing their DCs to something appropriate. And at 12th level, another game changer, Lightning Snares. The Snare Crafter gets this one again 2 levels later at 14th level. Now you can put a snare down during an encounter as a single action. That's giant. Also, just want to point out here too, at level 9, Rangers get Nature's Edge as a class feature. And if an enemy is in difficult terrain from a snare, they're flat-footed. So now your level 1 Hampering Snare creates a 10 by 10 area of difficult terrain. Or there's the Torrent Snare. It's uncommon, but it's bigger. It creates a 3 by 3 area of difficult terrain, and it can trip and move the target that triggers it if they critically fail. At 16th level 2, the Ranger gets Ubiquitous Snares, lets you get doubles the number of prepared snares from the Snare Specialist. So more snares, that's good. The Snare Crafter archetype has some unique things that they can do that Rangers couldn't do. There's Surprise Snare. It's a 4th level feat. For 3 actions, you can deploy a snare on an adjacent target. It's a lot of actions, but it could help you to get a snare effect out during a combat, like a Stalkerbane snare if you suddenly got attacked by an invisible monster, so it could be useful. The Remote Trigger lets you diffuse snares with a ranged weapon or set off your own snares at range, which could be useful, I guess. And Giant Snare at level 10 lets you make your snares in a 10 by 10 area instead of a 5-foot square, which is huge. You have to decide when you're making your snares for the day which size to make them, and the bigger ones use twice the amount of slots you have, but bigger area to be triggered. This might make the 3-action Surprise Snare worthwhile. If you dropped a damaging snare on a 10-foot by 10-foot area, that might be worth the 3 actions to use it. And at level 12, Plentiful Snares. It's just like Ubiquitous Snares. It lets you double the number of prepared snares from your Snare Crafter dedication. That's great though, more snares. The Cobbled Ancestry, it also has some unique feats to make your snares better. You can improve your snares using Ancestry feats. At 9th level, a Cobble can use a reaction when a snare is triggered to make a distraction or to demoralize when a creature fails or critically fails a save against one of their snares. So that's a great thing. And at level 13, they can add in Vicious Snares, and it just adds in more damage to their snares. Those are great little things for your snare build. On to Snare Strategy. The first thing I would say about Snare Strategy is to have a plan A. And by that I mean be good at something else and have snares serve as a terrific supplement to that, because that is what they are. Remember, the real advantage, the real strength in the snare is their ability to deal damage on the monster's turn. Now, many of these snares can deal horrific and destruction. Look at the Scything Blade Snare in the core rulebook. It's level 12. It does 14 d8 damage with the basic reflex save. That's 60 damage average and 120 damage on a critical fail average. On a critical fail, the basic reflex save. That makes you want to use surprise snares and then spend 3 actions to drop that on someone, or even worse, prepare them as giant snares and then drop them on 4 people. And yeah, that's going to be awesome. That's going to be really nasty, but not as nasty as if they walked into that snare on their own turn, and then on your turn, you spent 3 actions peppering them with arrows. That's going to be the most devastating scenario you can come up with. So the most basic strategy with snares is going to be the kite to kill zone strategy. It's probably the best if you can pull it off. You set an area with a bunch of snares and pull monsters into that zone. One idea is to post up on the far side of a snare so that the monster has to move into it to attack you. This isn't always going to work. The whole thing can fall apart real easily, but when it does, it's going to be really devastating. Remember, you will set your own snares off if you move through that square, so always leave routes around your snares. Set snares at doors 5 feet back just in case so you can walk around them. In a 10-foot hallway, stagger them on either side of the hallway alternating so you can run around them if you have to run down that hallway. Now, if you set up a kill zone but the monsters don't immediately walk into your traps, you still have some options. There is a temptation to shove monsters into a nasty snare that you set, but that's going to use an attack action that counts against your multiple attack penalty. Maybe it's worth it. Sure, those snares are pretty nasty, but it will always be better to attack the monster and get the snare damage somehow on their own turn. So maybe weapons with critical specialization effects like clubs that move monsters back 10 feet, or pole arms that can move a monster 5 feet in any direction. Look, if you were a pole arm ranger, you could place a snare down as a single action with a lightning snare and then attack the monster from across the snare. If they move up, they walk into the snare. If they don't, if you roll a critical hit, you can then move them in the snare anyways. So maybe there are some spells that could move people around too. So maybe you could be a caster that could take the Snare Crafter archetype to take their spells to the next level, fusing spells and snares into nasty combinations. It could be really fun. And then, I need to talk a little quiet. I don't want the neighbors to hear this. There's the deluxe double snare maneuver. It's been banned in several continents on Galarian, and for good reason. Set up a torrent snare with a spike snare right next to it. When they walk into the torrent snare, if they critically fail their torrent snare save, move them into the spike snare with that force move action. They become prone, they take spike damage, and they're standing on difficult, or they're laying prone on difficult terrain, all on their own turn. Even if they don't critically fail the torrent snare save, there's still a spike snare out there that you can try and get them to walk into or push them into later. There is also the snare hop focus spell. This allows you to move a snare to a preferred location within the spell's range, but it can't be on a creature's location, so you're going to need surprise snare for that one. Again, this is 2 actions that cost a focus point. It's not ideal, but it could be really useful to have. This might not be a bad focus spell to have. Honestly, if you were doing snares, advice I would give, I wouldn't think too much about it. Every combat, if you have a moment before the fight starts, lay down as many snares as you can and hope that you catch someone one way or another. When they land, it's going to be really great. If they don't, it's not, the snares are free. They're not costing you anything. It's just going to be a really good supplement to your encounters. When they go off, it's going to be awesome. If they don't, have a plan A that works pretty good. And that is it. I've been your host, Crunch McDavels. This has been the Crunch McDavels Show. Please put down some traps to win the day with snares.